Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. We are here for the fifth in a 7-part series as we linger in the Bardo, Lincoln in the Bardo. This is the penultimate episode of reading, which will be followed, of course, by a series-ending review on the text itself. But what do we get in this installment of the text? Lincoln is leaving. He's decided to go. He's decided he can't ever come back. And everyone, overcome by the moment, overcome by the spectacle or the novelty or, god damn it, just the humanity of this event, they've all decided that they have to do their part to enter Lincoln and get him to stop. But when they do, they all feel the same relaxation and loss of self and sense of community that had Volman and Bevins felt when they entered Lincoln. And they found each other. They lose their kinks, as it were. Lincoln decides he's got to go ahead and leave anyway. So everyone goes and decides to say their goodbyes to Willie. And in the midst, hold on. Yeah, Lincoln kept going in the midst of their adulations, as they had all found one another and entered a different plane of existence. Lincoln kept going, and they all decide they've got to go say goodbye to Willie, because the same fate awaits him as awaits most young people who enter their domain, which is strange. This is never explained. I am not sure that it's going to be in the last little bit, but I'm going to have some nitpicks probably on that later this episode, so I'm not going to get into it too much here. And in the midst of their all crowding around Willie, there is a strange voice that gives them the choice of entombing Willie where he lay, or do they want to move him to the roof? It turns out that these vines of entrapment, they come from souls who are in hell, but not the worst realm of hell, and they're just doing their job, don't you know? They're just following the rules. The Reverend says, hey, let's get him to the roof. It would be a shame to have little Willie trapped in here. So let's get him to the roof. So the team from hell, they comply, and the Reverend says, as a matter of fact, I'll carry him. I'll do the due diligence here. I'll do the honor. Let me take him, carry him to the roof. And instead, the Rev grabs the boy, and runs like hell. He runs as he did when he was escaping hell. He runs like hell, and eventually the demons overrun the Rev, and he is gobbled up by vine growth, which for some reason happens a lot faster when they want it to. But I'm not going to get into that now. Eventually the demons overrun him, and he is gobbled up by the vine growth, and he matter lightning blooms himself away, and Volman and Bevins dig the boy out from the hollow that was left by the vines encapsulating the Reverend as he carried the boy. They encapsulated the Reverend as he was carrying the boy. They were on their way to the boy. Bevins takes off with the boy towards the chapel before he, too, is snatched up by the vines. And Volman gets Willie from Bevins and delivers him to the chapel. The chapel being the place where Abe is at the moment. So I have some beefs. Pardon me, I had something in my eye. I have some beefs with this section of the reading, as the world itself, the world in which we are, seems to have gone off the rails. Seems to have failed to capitulate. Plot holes, I think, is the way that it would be told in Hollywood, which is something we're going to get to a little bit later in this part of the read-along. But I want to direct our attention first to page 247, which I believe was the very first page of this reading, We had succeeded in hacking our way nearly through the waste belt with our nails and a sharp stone we found nearby. Are they allowed to interact with matter or not? If these spirits are indeed and in fact able and capable of interacting with matter, then it would seem much different a world than has been presented. Why must these spirits enter people in order to make their presence felt, in order to have some say on the way things are going? Why would that be necessary when they could just grab someone's book and fling it across the room, or grab a sharp stone and start hacking away at somebody? What the hell is on my glasses? And if they are able to do that, what kind of spirits are we talking about? What type of interaction do they have with the material world? Up to this point, it has been zero, besides those interactions they have had with the vine growth from individuals which are in hell. But even then, the vine growth seemed that it might be in a spiritual realm, on a spiritual plane, as they are capable of encapsulating spirits themselves. So I'm not sure exactly what we're doing here, and there are holes in that type of thought and plot. Why are they able, why is it necessary to hack away at these vines when these vines are not, seemingly not, in the physical world? If they're in the physical world, how is it that they're trapping spirits? That's just a strange nitpick. It's uncharacteristic of Saunders to sort of completely break his world in this way. Most of what Saunders writes is characterized as what is known as speculative fiction. Basically, it's the real world, but we tinker and tweak one small thing. A lot of the 10th of December short stories, I think, now that I'm realizing it, I think a lot of the 10th of December short stories, which was a compilation of his, have to do with drugs. A drug to control this, a drug to finagle that, which is very real world. Very, not mundane, but very real. So you figure, what would we do if we had a drug that could make someone fall in love, for example? That is speculative fiction. It's not real, but what if it was, huh? That's a lot of what Saunders deals with, and here he's doing a little bit more world building than those short stories do. So I'm wondering if, here we are 250 pages into things, he's just sort of lost track of his own world building. Moving on 256 here, we have this exchange. Bevins says, "We had forgotten so much of all else we had been and known." The Reverend says, "But now, through this serendipitous mass cohabitation," Roger Bevins finishes, "we found ourselves, like flowers from which placed rocks had been removed, being restored somewhat to our natural fullness." Volman says, "As it were." Reverend says, "It felt good." Volman says, "It did." Bevan says, "Very good." And the Reverend finishes, "And seemed to be doing us good as well." Getting out of the self and into the other is helping them lose their ego and thereby forget their anxieties, forget their kinks, forget those things which had trapped them in this nether world, this nether realm, this Bardo, or they seem to have been unable to let go of something in their lives because that thing in their lives was appended so neatly to their ego, so neatly to the thing which described them as they were, right? That's why the Reverend, the man of God, when he saw that he was going to hell, was completely incapable of accepting and grasping that reality. That is what locks him in the Bardo. And all of these characters are losing the sense of self. So if, for example, you're walking through a garden and you get snagged on a rose bush, that is that hang up, that is the rose bush, is the ego. So when we lose the rose bush with the thing that we loved, the rose, we lose the rose bush. The ego is gone and we're free to carry on. These are things which had trapped them in the Bardo, but on 259, those miraculous transformations among us notwithstanding, Mr. Lincoln was not stopping. This is to say that Lincoln is the great emancipator. Here he is freeing spirits from this realm as well as not being caught himself. In this way, we are looking at perhaps one of the reasons that Lincoln was chosen as the figurehead to put in a work about lingering in the Bardo. Lincoln being the great emancipator. The great emancipator meaning never sticking in one place too long. Lincoln had a long history of moving about, just moving about, going around, doing things, building and building and building, never staying in one place too long. So that is perhaps one of the fundamental symbolic reasons that it was Lincoln who was chosen. I mean, Saunders did not have to choose Lincoln to write this about. In that way, he could have chosen Andrew Jackson. He could have chosen George Washington. He could have chosen Alexander Graham Bell, for Christ's sake. He could have just made it a fictional story. But he chose Lincoln. And I think that Lincoln's reputation as the great emancipator is probably necessary and crucial to that choice. Moving on to 69, 10 pages in the future here, we have, I've lost myself here. Oh, yeah. He is a fine child, said Mr. Volman. A fine child with many... Here we are, 270 pages into this thing. Do we really know that Willie Lincoln is a fine child? I brought in some extracurricular texts. Saunders has done the work through extracurricular texts. Does anything in our reading to this point, anything in the narrative of the story, anything where Willie is present with the Reverend or with Volman or with Bevins, do any of those things put to use this idea of Willie as a fine child? Or is this all something that has simply been given to us? It is strange, and this is just, this is different than what I normally do. I normally talk about the symbolism and things like that in here. This is a point in this text where everything is sort of going to hell for me. Everything had been so neat and tidy, but now we're getting holes in logic for the world. We're being given by one of our main characters that Willie Lincoln is such a fine child. But we're left with the realization that Volman and Bevins and the Reverend, they have no real reason to believe that Willie is all that fine a child. We, as the reader, might. Because we, as the reader, have been given all of the extracurricular information that Saunders has provided for us. Bevins and Volman don't have that information. Bevins and Volman just know this is a kid. Bevins and Volman met Willie, what are we saying here? 12 hours ago? Something like that, maybe? This novel is taking place in very short order. In fact, I don't know. Maybe the actual short story, 10th of December, and he's got one called I Talk 3000 or something. Those might be the only short stories of his that I've read that take place in a shorter time period than the Puppy. I think Puppy happens during a single drive. I might be mistaken there. But it is weird to see this going on for Saunders, who is a very good writer. This is, however, his first novel. So it is understandable that we might have some kinks to work out. It's like the fourth time I've used the word kink this episode. Anyway, it is completely understandable that we'd have some things to work out here. And as my friend Kelsey reminded me 10 years ago, when I had an utter infatuation with Chuck Palahniuk, writers are allowed to be imperfect. And we're getting some imperfections here. But adding to this reason why perhaps Lincoln was chosen as the main symbol for this novel, we have here on 278, Lincoln, when he is being offered when Manders is offering him his lantern, as Lincoln sits in the chapel and Manders is about to go back to his post, Lincoln says, no, that's okay. Because, quote, he saw pretty good in the dark and always had. Is this symbolic speech about Lincoln and his reputation? He saw pretty good in the dark and always had. I am inclined to think so. I am inclined to believe that this is a hint from our author as to why Abraham Lincoln was chosen. He was someone who, when things were their hardest, decided, well, the world is hard. I've just got to be that much harder. And that is something which Lincoln, the historical figure, did just as well as Lincoln the character does here. Lincoln the character in this novel, like I say, I think that he only mentioned Lincoln's melancholy once, because if you read Lincoln's melancholy, the Lincoln in this novel feels gripped and dragged straight out of that text. It feels as if maybe old Saunders himself is covering his tracks by leaving Joshua Wolfshank's novel out to that extent, because it really does seem as that's where this entire character comes from. I can't stress that enough. Not in an accusatory fashion, but it really does feel that way if you've ever read Lincoln's Melancholy. So that is all for the textual things. I've got a couple other things to talk about, though. The Reverend really steals the show here when he grabs Willie and takes off. This is the growth of a protagonist. This is very, very Hollywood. This is something that Hollywood does because it's much easier to do in a movie than in a text, where you have a scene, namely the scene in which the Reverend flees hell and ends up in our story, where he learned something about himself and is then able to use what was previously a weakness, turn it on its head, and employ that tactic or fault in a way that is indeed quite heroic. This is something that is, like I say, very Hollywood, which is strange for Saunders as well. There is not a single short story that I haven't read all of Saunders' work. I have not read a single short story from Saunders that would make a good movie just translating it from page to screen. In this one either. As good a book as this has been, I don't think this makes a great movie. Yeah, I can't see this. I can't see this on the screen, and I wonder if that's what Saunders was going for, was a bit of a Hollywood turn, because along with that, what we have is the vacant role of the protagonist as left by Bevins and Volman. I say vacant, left vacant, because the only heroic thing they did was accidentally sort of discover that they are able to, in fact, encroach on other people's decisions and change them for them. And even then, is that all that heroic a thing to do? To sort of brainwash somebody? Is that all that heroic a thing to do? I don't know. How are we to feel about the fact that we had been with Volman and Bevins this entire time? We had been led to believe that they are our protagonists this entire time, just to, at the very end, hand the boy off to the Rev, where he is able to then scoop the boy up and take off. Now, sure, Volman and Bevins do follow in turn and end up finishing the job. But that's not, the hero is not supposed to finish the job. He's supposed to start and finish the job. But that turn from the Reverend feels very Hollywood. And the Reverend, we are left to question, is something that you do in the Bardo impactful enough that it can transform your afterlife from the precipice of hell over to going to heaven? And why might that thing be, when all you were doing is trying to get someone else in position to make a decision? All we're doing here is trying to get someone else in position to make a decision. Is this self-sacrifice? Is the act of doing this self-sacrificial? And if it is, how so? How so? The Reverend has already fled the scene once. Is he unable to do it again? I think that these are questions that are not answered here, and hopefully we get some answer in the next bit of reading. But that is all I have for this episode. I hope to have you back for what we're looking at here is page 279 through the end of the book for next week. And then the following week we will have the review for Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. Again, I hope to have you back.